Hello all and welcome. We apologize for the issues, the technical issues. I've got Ed here and I'm going to turn on my screen share and we're going to get started. Okay, it's all yours, Ed.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it. And I thank you in advance for everyone's patience and understanding. Not the first time, nor the last, that technology gives us some unexpected challenges and opportunities. I'm Edward Segal, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today about crisis management. And because of the tech issues that we're having, Sarah has graciously agreed to become, I guess, the high-tech equivalent of Vanna White, and she'll be turning my slides every time I need her. Since I'm not able to do it where I am in beautiful downtown Washington. So I'm going to share with you today my advice and insights on how to prepare for, manage, and importantly, bounce back from disasters, scandals, and other emergencies. Sarah? The advice I'll be sharing with you today is based on my experience as the Chief Executive Officer of 2 trade associations where I had to deal with a lot of crisis situations. I'm also going to share with you my recommendations that are based on how to manage a crisis, but also practical advice that I've given to dozens of other clients on how to prepare for, manage, and recover from disasters, scandals, and other emergencies. I also, of course, have a background in public relations and journalism and was a marketing strategies columnist for the Wall Street Journal's website for entrepreneurs. And I've written 2 books on public relations. In fact, I just last week finished writing a new book on crisis management. The ebook will be available on April 21 and the paperback edition in June. In fact, we're going through some last-minute edits and changes to make it relevant to what's happening in the world with the coronavirus. Sarah? But before we get started and get too far into this, I want to take a moment to define what a crisis is so we're on the same page about this. I define a crisis as any internal or external event that can impact the image, the reputation, the activity, the bottom line, or even the future of a company or a business. And a crisis can hurt the recruitment, retention of employees. It can diminish staff morale, expose a company to legal risks. It's a long list of things that, if they go wrong, how they can impact various aspects of the organizations. The other reality is that some corporate emergencies may never become known to the public. It's an internal matter that no one finds out about outside the world, while other crises can actually generate news reports, international headlines, and social media posts. One crisis might go over a day, while another could drag on for days, weeks, or months. But no matter what the crisis is or how it impacts your company, it's absolutely essential to put it behind you as soon as possible and get back to normal as quickly as possible. Sarah? I'm a big believer in doing everything you can to avoid a crisis in the first place. But what can you do to lessen the risks of having a crisis? Well, it depends on what kind of crisis you want to avoid. For example, if you want to make sure you don't have an accounting-related crisis, you can make sure you have standard accounting firewall protections in place to lessen the likelihood that there'll be fraud or embezzlement at your company. If you want to take steps to protect yourself against allegations of sexual assault or sexual harassment, then it's important to have policies and procedures in place that you require training for all members of your staff for these anti-harassment, anti-abuse best practices. Unfortunately, it's impossible, literally impossible, to prevent every possible crisis from happening, such as an accident. How do you guard against an accident? Well, that's very difficult. But I'm also a big believer in being as prepared as possible so that when, not if you have a crisis, you'll have policies and procedures in place to guide you through it. But being prepared means having a crisis management and communication plan and holding drills and exercises throughout the year to make sure that the plan will work when necessary. To me, there's not much difference between having no plan and having a plan but not practicing it. You have to have it in place, but you also have to make sure that your plan works. And I'll talk more in a few minutes about best practices in preparing a crisis management plan. Sarah? The coronavirus crisis, of course, is on everyone's mind. That's all we seem to be thinking about, watching, talking about, and worrying about. And it's also on the mind, of course, I'm sure with you folks who are listening in today or watching the recording later on. It's on the minds of companies and organizations who are trying to figure out what the heck to do next as this crisis continues to unfold. Unfortunately, there are so many unanswered or perhaps even unanswerable questions about this current crisis. For example, are we at the beginning of or the end of the crisis? We don't know. Is the end in sight? We don't know. How long is it going to be until the crisis ends? We don't know. Is it a one-time crisis, or will the virus return every year like the flu? We don't know. How will the virus change the ways we live and work? Well, we've certainly seen in the last few days and weeks the dramatic effect it's having on all of us, depending upon where we live, but we're feeling it one way or the other. So we don't know if this is a temporary issue or this is going to permanently change the way we live and work. And is the effect that the crisis is having on the national and even the global economies, is that going to be temporary or permanent? Again, we just don't know right now. Sarah? So the coronavirus crisis does have a lot in common with other disasters and national emergencies that we've gone through over the last more than 100 years. This crisis was sudden and unexpected. No one was prepared or trained for it. Even if businesses had a crisis plan in place, they realized all too late that they needed a comprehensive contingency plan to deal with this particular crisis. Another thing we have in common with other crises is that people scrambled to respond quickly and in the best ways they could to deal with this unexpected, devastating situation. Also in common is the fact that experts were consulted for guidance on what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. But it's still, as has been the case with a lot of crises, especially in the early stage, it's simply not clear how long it will take to recover and how long it will take to get us back to a normal situation. Sarah? Unfortunately, many businesses are flying blind and have no plans and no idea what to do about this crisis. So I want to share with you my advice on how you can survive this crisis. Sarah? Rule number one to survive the coronavirus crisis is don't do anything that may add to people's anxiety, their fear, or concerns about the pandemic. Don't make things any worse than they are. Everything you say or do should help provide as much confidence and as much accurate information as possible. Sarah? Another thing to do right away is to obtain the facts about the crisis, but only from credible sources, such as the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the World Health Organization. Be sure to keep a very close eye on how COVID-19 is affecting any and all aspects of your business. That includes, of course, your employees, sales, inventory, customers, new business prospects. Be sure to follow and share the latest news and developments about the virus and how it affects your company, employees, and customers. But also be sure to cite the source of information and alerts. And don't repeat rumors, speculation, or questionable social media posts. Sarah? essentially stay human in this crisis. Express empathy and understanding for what others may be thinking or feeling. This is, as we all know, a very tough time for a lot of people in this country and around the world. Sarah? Another rule for surviving this crisis is to communicate. Let people know exactly how the crisis is affecting your company and what your company is doing or will be doing about it. You should be the single reliable source of credible information about how the disease is impacting your business. Be transparent. Post and distribute information, updates, key messages about the impact of the virus on your business. If it's appropriate, feel free to establish a 24/7 hotline as another way to help answer questions or concerns from worried customers, investors, or the public. But don't minimize or try to sugarcoat the bad news. As bad as it could be, don't gloss over it and don't make it sound better than it is. Remember that people can find information about your company, your business, or too often inaccurate information about your company or your business from a variety of sources. So always be sure to tell the truth, no matter how much it may cost. Otherwise, your credibility and the trust that people have placed in your company will suffer, and there's no way to predict whether, when, or how to be able to regain that credibility and that trust. Sarah? If you have a crisis plan now, by all means, follow it and implement it. Then test and update it on a regular basis to address the current virus crisis. If you don't have a plan, and the reality is most companies and businesses, they don't have a plan, then I think it's important to get one right away. And I'll be talking about that in a few minutes about what you need to do to prepare a good, effective crisis management plan. It's important to let people know that you have that plan for dealing with this or any other crisis. And having that plan and letting people know you have it can actually provide an important level of confidence that you know what you're doing, and how you're doing it, and when you're doing it, and why you're doing it. But you're doing it in a logical, comprehensive, and coordinated fashion. Sarah? It's important indeed in surviving this crisis to get the help you need, to be resourceful. If you're lacking services or expertise, you don't have it to get through the crisis, don't hesitate to bring in the expertise you need to get the job done and to get it done right. Sarah? It's important to stay informed, to stay ahead of the curve, essentially. As the crisis continues, and it does seem to be getting worse almost by the hour, go ahead and work up your own confidential worst-case projections about the impact you think the crisis will have on your business, how it will affect your company, your employees, your customers, and then plan your next steps accordingly. Now, this includes, of course, figuring out how you will bounce back after the crisis is over. Because as in any crisis that we've had in our history, there's always a crisis, there's always the next crisis, but the crisis that we're in always passes. We just don't know how long, so you have to have that crisis plan in place to help survive this one. Sarah? So is there a light at the end of the tunnel? We have no idea. So don't assume that the crisis will end soon. And we may, unfortunately, be in for a long and bumpy ride. Sarah? So I want to share with you now the best practices for managing this crisis, or any crisis as a matter of fact. But there's a right way and a wrong way to manage a crisis. In my book on crisis management, I've identified more than 100 best practices for dealing with dozens of different crisis situations. And fortunately, we don't have the time today to go through each one of those best practices, but I do want to take the time now to share with you some of the what I consider to be the most important ones. And the first best practice, of course, is to act quickly when there is a crisis. You know, we've had a history of disasters and crisis situations and national emergencies throughout the course of our country, and they seem to follow a predictable and unfortunately a disturbing pattern. There's often a tendency to ignore a crisis or pretend it doesn't exist, or even if it becomes impossible to ignore it, they'll deny it. And denial is often found followed by grudging acceptance that yes, we do have a crisis, and then a hurry up to try to deal with the crisis. That seems to be the pattern for way too many of the crises that we've had in our country. So the first best practice is act quickly, don't deny it, don't try to ignore it, and the sooner you deal with it, the better, because the sooner you deal with a crisis, the more likely it is that you'll get over the crisis and return it to normal. So as soon as you know there is something wrong, take immediate action to address the situation. Or if a crisis is beyond your control, as the COVID-19 crisis certainly is, do the best you can, respond and protect your best interest. Sarah? Another best practice is research. Do your homework about the crisis. Get all the facts about the crisis, and that essentially is the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how of the crisis. You need all the details or as many details as possible, depending upon the crisis, before you can reasonably expect to take prudent and appropriate action to deal with it. But also be sure you have the right facts, the current facts, and the accurate facts. You can't afford to be going off and using wrong, inaccurate, or simply outdated information. Sarah? Another best practice is, and depending upon the crisis you're going through, is the need to deal with news organizations. If your crisis is reported by or comes to the attention of news organizations, you really have to engage with and monitor social media and mainstream media for what they're saying about you. And depending upon the crisis, you should consider being proactive and letting the media know that you are having that crisis, because the more you are proactive in notifying the media, the more control you're likely to have in kind of news coverage that you may get. If word leaks out about a crisis you're having, as the media starts showing up and on your doorstep and making calls and emails and texts demanding information, you really are not going to have a choice, but you're going to have to deal with the media and tell your side of the story. Again, stay with the facts of what you know, the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and if you know, the how of the crisis. It's important, though, to monitor the news organizations, to follow what they are saying and reporting about you. All too often, news organizations do make mistakes of facts, figures, any aspect of a news story can be the subject of an error, a mistake on the part of the news organizations. So it's important to monitor the news organizations for the stories they're doing about you, and if you see an error, you need to quickly correct that by sending an email, making a phone call, contacting the reporter. You can't let mistakes stand, or else the mistakes eventually become regarded as conventional wisdom. So if you don't correct the mistakes, people assume that that information is true and correct. So do respond quickly to all media inquiries. You're not going to have the luxury of saying, well, Joe Blow from XYZ TV station called, I'll get back to them when I can. No, responding to calls from the media as quickly as you can is important for their story. They will likely be reaching out to you for your side of what's happening, and you can use the news organizations as a bullhorn to make sure your side of the crisis is getting out there. Sarah? Another best practice is leadership and management of the crisis. You really need to show that you are in charge, that you know about the crisis, and that you're doing something to address or solve the crisis. That means that when you see or hear something that's wrong or causing a crisis, you have to do something about it, and you have to do it immediately. Prioritize the steps that you think are necessary to address the problem, but don't jump to any conclusions. You need a fact-based crisis management strategy. Don't guess, don't speculate, don't wish, don't deny, don't jump to conclusions. Whatever you do or whatever you say needs to be grounded on fact and reality. Also, don't minimize the crisis. Don't poo-poo it or say, that's no big deal. Sure, there was a mass shooting at our office, but, this happens all the time. No, you can't do anything even remotely saying that. You can't come across as callous or disregarding the seriousness of a situation. You have to deal with the facts, report the facts, but don't trivialize any crisis because it's important to some people, very important to others. And if you are the sole source or an important source of the information, you have to be a straight shooter and just stay with the facts. Of course, if you make a mistake, if you say something wrong, you do something wrong, the sooner you own up to it, the sooner you apologize for it, the sooner you explain what happened and why. It's really important to be upfront about that. But the more careful you are in what you say and how you say it, where you say it and when you say it, those strategies will help, but not necessarily guarantee that you're not going to say something that you're going to regret. Sarah? Another best practice is to take action. As I said earlier, as soon as you know that there's a problem or there's a crisis, you have to act immediately. You need to do what you can as soon as you can. But you should have a strategy for doing whatever you're going to be doing to address the crisis. That means setting realistic deadlines, not guessing when things are going to happen or hoping when things are going to happen, but setting reality-based deadlines for what will happen. You need to move quickly. You just can't sit on your hands and sit around and hope something will happen to resolve the crisis. You have to move quickly and do your best to deal with the situation at hand. Of course, in your efforts to do something and to do something quickly, you should not be making matters worse from what you say or what you do. So it should be measured, it should be thoughtful, it should be comprehensive, it should be done strategically. You don't want to make a bad crisis even worse. And then finally, don't point fingers or cast blame. Too often in many crises that we've seen, and we'll get to some examples in a few minutes, people seem to be all too ready to say, well, it's so-and-so's fault, or so-and-so didn't know what they were doing, or so-and-so didn't know what they were saying. And it's not my fault, it's their fault. Don't get into the finger-pointing blame game, because all too often, when people point out or try to point out it was someone else's fault, they regret that. And we'll talk about some good examples about that in a few minutes. Sarah? Another best practice is communication. It's always important to notify, depending upon the emergency, of course, or the crisis, notify the proper authorities, whether it's first responders, your insurance company, law enforcement. It just depends what the crisis is, of course. But if there is a higher authority that you need to notify about the crisis, be sure they are notified immediately. When it's appropriate, I think you also need to apologize if, of course, something is your fault. The American public is often very forgiving for people and companies when they make a mistake. And the sooner a chief executive officer or the chair of a board of directors or other corporate leaders, the sooner that you're upfront and issue an apology and regret and remorse, that can go a long way in helping to repair whatever damage, or some of the damage anyway, that was done by the crisis in the first place. I said earlier it's important to come across as being human when dealing with the coronavirus crisis. Same thing for any crisis. You want to come across as sympathetic. You want to come across as empathizing with people. You want to show that you are a human being and you know and you care and you feel their pain. And that could go a long way in helping to improve or enhance your public image and your public reputation. But also don't speculate on the cause of a crisis. Don't speculate on how long it's going to last. Don't speculate, period. Stay to the facts of what you know and make sure what you know and what you say is as current as possible. Don't hide the bad news. If there is something happening in your company and you know it's going to be coming out, the sooner you take the lead in announcing it, the better. You are in a stronger public relations position if you're the one who's announcing the bad news than if, say, an investigative reporter finds something and leads their evening newscast with this horrible story of what they found out at the XYZ company. If you're in charge, you're in control, and that can help make sure that the messaging is coming out the way you want, at least initially. So don't cover it up and don't hide the bad news. And then finally, after the crisis is over, or if it's appropriate, even while there is a crisis, thank those who have helped you, whether it's the first responders, law enforcement, hospital officials, healthcare workers. Again, it depends on the crisis. But people like to be thanked, and depending upon the crisis you're facing, you may have opportunities to work with a lot of people, a lot of different industries, and different professions. And if they provide help in any way to you as you're navigating and getting through and solving the crisis and surviving the crisis, thanking them is really important. They'll appreciate it, and the public will appreciate it. Sarah? Well, as I said earlier, there are a lot of lessons we can learn from how well and sometimes how poorly other people and organizations have gone through other crisis situations. I think it's always better to learn from the mistakes of others than who have gone through a crisis than for you to go through a crisis and learn the hard way what you should have said or what you should have done. So I have a handful of examples I want to go over right now on what you can learn from some recent crisis situations. One thing that can be learned from the still unfolding COVID-19 crisis is the fact that it's important to have a plan and to test and to make sure the plan worked. We didn't see any of that related to even the speculation that there might be a coronavirus attack or even any kind of pandemic. So having a plan and importantly testing to make it work are some of the most obvious to me lessons from the COVID-19 crisis. Other lessons I've seen just in the weeks that this has been thrust upon the world stage, you need to heed early warnings. Even if it's in another country, another hemisphere, another part of the world, if there's something that might make it to our country or be a problem for us or for your company, take it as an early warning and use that warning as a way to help arm yourself and protect yourself to make sure that if it does happen or does reach us, that you're prepared. You don't want to be surprised. Having enough of the right resources. We certainly could use that right now, given the scramble for ventilators and other personal protective equipment that our healthcare professionals are urgently looking for. Another early lesson is you need to respond quickly. Don't sit, don't delay, don't ignore, don't deny. When you know there's a problem, respond immediately. Tell the truth as you see it is another good lesson. And accurately gauge the impact of the crisis. Know, based on projections, consulting experts, we should be doing a better job early on in gauging and determining and projecting the impact of this crisis. on our country and the world. And then finally, learn from the experiences of others. Other countries around the world had to deal and are still dealing with the coronavirus, and we should be profiting, taking advantage of, and learning what they've gone through and how we can apply their mistakes, their successes, their knowledge for how they've dealt with a crisis. How can we apply that to this particular crisis? Sarah? Another lesson to learn from, this continues to be in the news, is how Boeing responded to their crisis of two of their jet planes crashing within a short period of time. Of course, I could do an entire webinar about all the lessons we can learn from the Boeing crisis. And as their crisis continues to roll out, the more we find out about the reasons behind the crash of their planes, the worse things seem to get for the company. But I try to take a look at the immediate aftermath of a crisis in the days and weeks and months right after something happened. So just looking at the early stages of this crisis, there are important lessons to be learned. A basic rule of crisis management is that, for example, as soon as you see there's a problem, you should do something about it. And as the investigation into the plane crashes continued, it was reported, accurately as it later turned out, that the company actually knew there were problems with the plane about 2 years before they crashed. So I thought that was an incredible black mark against a company, that they knew there was a problem and they did nothing about it. It turned out to be a software problem. But in the early stages of the crisis, there were hearings held by congressional committees on Capitol Hill in Washington. And at one of the committee meetings, the members of Congress and even federal officials started blaming the pilots for the crash. And the pilot union got upset because they didn't think that was the case. And of course, casting that kind of blame, they were entirely wrong, because it was, as we saw later, it wasn't the pilots to blame, but it was a software issue, and that tied back into Boeing. So refrain from casting blame, don't point fingers, because the more you do it, the more trouble you're going to be in. It turns out that you were wrong. But frankly, there is no reason from a crisis management or PR standpoint that anyone should cast any blame for anybody about anything in the immediate aftermath of a crisis. After there's an investigation, if there's studies, if there's law, legal action, and it goes through those kind of processes or procedures, and then down the road, official investigation shows that there was indeed a cause, there was indeed blame, leave it for others to come up with that determination. But you should not be in the blame game yourself. Sarah? Another crisis to learn from is Starbucks. You might recall their crisis they went through when two black men were arrested at one of their restaurants in Philadelphia. Starbucks, I think, did the right, reasonable, prudent thing. They apologized immediately for the incident, and then they didn't stop there. They later closed almost all of their stores in the country in order to provide anti-discrimination training to all of their employees. The fact that they closed their stores and they provided that training, they got a lot of good positive publicity for it. And I think the apology and the training did take several important steps to help repair the image. Unfortunately, not too long later, in a different part of the country, they had almost an identical situation at one of their restaurants in Arizona, and an employee asked a handful of police officers who were just having their coffee. The employee told the officers to leave. So that created a whole other round of bad publicity. And the lesson here is that you can do the right thing, but you also have to make sure that what you fix stays fixed. So just because you solve one crisis and it goes away, doesn't mean you're going to have another crisis that you have to deal with at some point. Sarah? My last example I want to share with you, what we can learn from others, is the Swedish retailer chain, IKEA. They had to deal with their own crisis. It was not earth-shaking, to be sure. It was kind of amusing, but it still resulted in bad publicity for the company. And that's when a customer of IKEA discovered that a map, a world map that the retailer was selling, was actually missing a country. The entire country of New Zealand was left off the map. And not only was it embarrassing for the failure to pay attention to detail, but at the time, IKEA was planning on opening up more stores in New Zealand. So this was not good timing, not that there's a good timing for a crisis, but this was really embarrassing on a lot of different levels. And the world became aware of this snafu because the customer who noticed that New Zealand had been left off the map, they took a picture of the map and posted it online, and that map picture got a lot of coverage around the world. IKEA quickly did the right thing. They apologized, and they said they would fix this rather embarrassing mistake. But this is a crisis that could have been avoided. There's some crises that are inevitable or beyond your control, and others that if you have slowed down and paid more attention, in this case, this crisis, I think, could have been prevented. But all that people had to do was the people who were making the map, they should have checked the map to make sure that the map was accurate. So, some blame appropriately fell on the people who made the map. But then, of course, the staff at IKEA, who made the decision to sell the map at their stores, they should have paid close attention to the map. Assuming that all maps are accurate, it's a great assumption, but in this case, it was wrong. And rather than assuming that the map was correct, they should have looked at it closely to ensure that it was, in fact, accurate. Sarah? Now, I mentioned a couple times today the importance of having a crisis management plan. And I want to share with you what I consider to be some of the essential aspects of a crisis management plan. And I'm going to be sharing with you, and I'll share with you, tell you how we'll do that, a free crisis plan template that each one of you today, or those who are listening to the recording later on, can use this template I prepared to prepare your own customized crisis management plan. All crisis management plans are not alike in terms of everything that they cover. The best crisis plans are those that are customized and tailored for the companies, the businesses, and the organizations that need them. But there are a couple dozen categories I've identified that I think should be part of any plan. And which ones you use and the information you fill in has to be unique, of course, to your business. So the plan I'll be sending you has about 24 different categories of information that I think any organization needs in order to properly and effectively deal with a crisis. And I'll leave at the end of our session today my email address, and all you need to do is send me an email saying you'd like a copy of the plan, and I'll shoot back to you right away with a Word version of the crisis management plan, and feel free to customize it and use it as you like, but make sure it meets your needs and your concerns and your priorities for your company. In the meantime, though, I want to walk you through the major parts of this generic plan. Sarah? The first thing you need to deal with in any crisis plan, the first of the 24 major categories, is the crisis triggers. What is it for your business that is going to cause you to have a crisis? Only you know, because you are the world's foremost expert on your businesses and your organizations. You know what your worst case scenarios are going to be. You know what might go wrong, what could go wrong, what you hope will never go wrong, but only you will know the details of that, and that's where you become the experts in terms of what is the crisis trigger that would cause a crisis for us. We have to activate our plan. Sarah? The crisis plan should include what I call the 5 W's and the H. It is essentially the details of what happened in your crisis that you should know when you trigger the plan and you have to deal with a crisis. So the 5 W's and the H, it's what happened, where it happened, when it happened, who does it affect, why did it happen, and how did it happen. The 5 W's and the H. Very important to have details because you need to know all the details, or as much as possible, before you can make reasonable, informed decisions on the next steps for dealing with the crisis. Sarah? So the action steps, based on the 5 W's and the H, what are the specific things you have to do to address or solve the crisis? What was the crisis trigger? What crisis are you facing? And what are the immediate practical steps you need to take to address the problem? Sarah? Resources. As I said earlier, sometimes you won't have all the expertise or the resources you need to deal with a crisis, and you need to know, depending upon the crisis you're having, what is it that you need, whether it's money, expertise, consultants, independent contractors, legal advice, HR, public relations, advertising, the list goes on and on and on of what you might need. But when you are actually having the crisis, you need to cherry pick and identify and retain the best services that you can to address the specifics of your crisis. Sarah? Another part of the plan is milestones and deadlines. What do you have to do and in what order to address the crisis? You can't just say, well, we're going to get around to it as soon as we can. ASAP often means it's never going to get done. So you need to commit to what, based on what you know has to be done to address the crisis, what are the deadlines, reasonable, achievable deadlines that you need to set to meet those deadlines? Because the sooner you do that, the sooner your crisis can be solved, and you'll be able to get back to normal. Sarah? Of course, it's very important to have a crisis management team. Now, whether you need the team, it really depends on the size of your business and the nature of the crisis. But I like to plan for worst case scenarios. So I recommend all my clients, no matter how large or how small they are, I think they need to have a crisis management team in place as soon as possible. It is never too early to start thinking about who would manage a crisis for your business. It could be you, it could be top officials of your company, members of your board of directors, employees, outside experts. Maybe it's a combination. But the point is this: the best crisis plan in the world is useless without having anyone to implement it. And waiting until there is a crisis to appoint a response team to manage it means we're really losing some very valuable time that would otherwise be spent on dealing with the situation. And who's going to be on your crisis team? Again, it depends on the size and nature and structure of your company. It could be HR, it could be IT, it could be legal. It's a long list of who could be on the team. But you need to pick the best people who would be available on a 24/7 basis to deal with the crisis if the plan is activated and when the team has to go into action. But before it is needed for an actual crisis, it's important that the team should meet and to practice and talk through some of the worst case scenarios. Just as it's important to practice the plan itself before you need it, it's also important to make sure that members of the crisis management team can work well together. You have the right people in the right places doing the right things for the right reasons. And also, if there's any rough spots in the team working together or scenarios that were not anticipated, the sooner this team starts to work together, the better off they're going to be if and when they are activated to deal with a crisis. Sarah? Key contacts. Every crisis plan needs to have a list of who needs to be informed about the crisis. Again, who those people are depends on the nature of your business, structure, and so on. But it should be as comprehensive as possible. And be sure to include their contact information, their office, their cell phones, after evenings, phone numbers. But so many people don't have landlines anymore, so make sure at the very least you get all of their cell phone numbers, emails, and so on. It's really important to contact these people and know who you're going to contact when, depending on the crisis. But at what point, for example, would you notify your board of directors? At what point would you notify legal? It just depends on the nature of the crisis. But the more you're thinking through all of these what-if scenarios, not just for the crises, but who to contact, then you're more likely to be moving in a reasonable, rational, appropriate, logical fashion if you have to deal with a crisis. Sarah? Of course, red tape is a universal problem, but in a crisis, it can be a very irritating and counterproductive and serious situation. So in your plan, figure out ahead of time what's the red tape you're going to have to deal with or hopefully cut in order to implement the plan and get the things done that have to be done. Sarah? Just importantly as the red tape is the approval. Depending upon the size of your business, you may need to get the okay of others before you can do anything about the crisis. But because speed is so important in any crisis, be sure to include in your crisis plan information about who must approve what, in what order for you to deal with the crisis. Sarah? And then I think it's important then to talk now about how you're going to get this crisis management plan I've been talking about. All I'd like you to do is send me an email. Sarah, is it showing up? Yes. Let me back up for just a minute.
Sorry.
We talked about the approvals. We talked about the notifications. Importantly, you need to talk about in your plan the steps for recovery. Just because you're in the middle of a crisis doesn't mean you should stop thinking about how you're going to recover from it. So at least give some thought at the end of your crisis plan, what steps do you need to take to recover from it. Cheryl? So the generic plan, I'll be glad to send to each one of you. It covers a lot of ground, but I designed it so it can be customized for your need and your situation. Just send me an email, and that email address is on your screen now. getcrisisready@gmail.com. That's getcrisisready@gmail.com. Sarah? And then I want to end by talking about how to recover from a crisis. Because recovery is so important, and getting back to normal operations is so absolutely critical for any business. So the basic steps for recovering from a crisis. Step one, apologize. If you are at fault, it's appropriate to apologize, but I would also not apologize until you've talked with appropriate legal counsel. There are laws, called sorry laws in the United States, and they do have something to say about liability and legal issues related to when you issue an apology. So as important as apologies are, it's important that they're done the right way and after consulting with legal counsel. Sarah? Another way to recover from this crisis is to help prevent the next crisis. And you do that by, based on what you went through with this crisis, update and implement your company policies and procedures to help ensure there will not be a repeat of the same crisis or any other crisis. So prevention is important. Sarah? Learn. What did you learn from your current crisis, and how will you apply those lessons so that the crisis does not happen again? Sarah? Commit. Promise those who were impacted or affected by the crisis that you will learn from it and you will do something about it. Sarah? Remember, don't forget what made you a successful business in the first place. And try to get back to your roots or draw upon your strength, your resources, your lessons, your expertise. Everything that made you a success the first time, you need to identify and use those as the building blocks to help rebuild your business. If it does come to that, as I said earlier, some crises are here and gone in the day. Some crises never become known outside the inner sanctums of the company. And others are much more serious, resulting in headlines that can actually lead to legal issues and threaten the future of the company. But remember what made you good and great in the beginning, and depending upon the crisis, you're going to have to draw from the original strength to build again. Sarah? And then define success. How will you know when you have bounced back that everything has returned to normal? Is it a matter of achieving sales goals, whatever it is for your company? Define what success means so you have a definite goal to work on. Sarah? And measure. You need to establish milestones to measure your progress on the road to recovery from the crisis. And only those measurements should be. Sarah? Take stock. Determine the inventory. Evaluate, use your resources, talents, skills, and abilities to bounce back from the crisis. So that's what I have to share with you today. I know we've covered a lot of ground, and I want to thank Sarah again for her help and her advice and her counsel, and for helping to make this technology challenged session doable. And I will end with the last slide. We had a question side. Sarah, I don't know how you want to handle the questions.
So
we're coming up on our hour for the session, but we also have the last slide with my name and my email. It's getcrisisready@gmail.com. Visit my website at publicrelations.com. And if you'd like to talk, confidentially, of course, I'd be glad to take your calls and see how I can be of assistance going forward. And that number is on the screen. So again, thank you all. I've enjoyed this opportunity to share my advice and expertise with you. And I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Okay. I do have a question. Do you have any suggestions or specifics for people right now as they're in the middle of this crisis and as we struggle to stay open and just maintain daily business?
Well, the first is to inventory your own resources. How much, in practical terms, how much money do you have in the bank? How much loans do you have that you can tap into? As you know, the federal government has passed a $2 trillion recovery aid package, and I know there are lots and lots of money available through the Small Business Administration and other sources. So in a crisis of this magnitude, it's really important because of accommodation. Because after the crisis is over, you're going to want to have these people back, I'm assuming, or some of them back, and start the rebuilding process. So you have to know what you need now to survive, where you can get the help you need to survive, and but don't do anything drastic that could make it harder than it's going to be already to get back on the road to recovery. So be very careful.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Nobody? Okay, we'll send this out to everybody as well as anyone that registered and had to get off early, and we'll send out your contact information too, Ed. We want to thank everybody for joining, and we apologize for all of the technical difficulties we had at the beginning. And if anybody has anything else, you can reach out to us too at administration@unitedservicers.com. Actually, I do have one more question, Ed. It says we have customers coming in to pick up parts. We have taken all the precautions, but how do we know if these customers have? How do we know if they're following the rules?
Unfortunately, we don't. And trust in this day and age can be very iffy. I've seen several situations where in fact, this happened just the other day when I was picking up some medicines for my dog at the veterinary. I paid for it over the phone with my credit card. I drove to the vet's office. I called when I was outside their office on the street. They came out. I used a remote control open up my trunk of my car, and she dropped the package in my trunk. Then my wife got out and closed the trunk. So there was no contact. You might consider, depending upon your business and where it's located and logistics and so on, of doing something so there is as minimal or no actual human contact with the pickup of the merchandise. Make it as easy as possible to continue to serve your customers. Make it as easy as possible for them to get what they had ordered, but also make it as safe as possible for when they come by to pick it up, that you're taking all these procedures. Something else you might want to consider, and I saw this at a local grocery store just the other day, they're actually handing out plastic gloves to all the customers, so they will have gloves while they're doing shopping in the store, or if their hands touched the doorknob and so on like that. So think through and be as aggressive as you can be about these important safety issues.
Perfect. I think that's it. I haven't seen any other questions come in. So thank you very much, Ed. And we will be in touch for sure. And I'm sure people will be reaching out to you as well.
All right. Thank you all. Good luck and stay safe.
Thank you, everybody. Everybody be safe out there.